Defeating radical terrorism is a top priority for the White House, as well as for several African leaders, where militant groups have taken hold. President Trump has expanded military engagement in the most conflict-affected areas, but critics note his proposed budget cuts target development programs aimed at reducing conflict and creating stability. Hello, I'm Carol Pineau. Welcome to our special series, Africa and the Trump Administration. President Trump, in a major speech in Saudi Arabia, called on Muslim leaders to drive terrorists out of their countries. As militant groups spread across East, West, and North Africa, leaders from Africa hardly needed convincing. In recent years, conflict in Africa has dramatically changed. In 2000, more than a dozen countries were involved in civil wars or border conflicts, but militant extremism was almost non-existent. Since then, 4 major militant groups have spread, and their attacks are increasing in frequency and becoming more deadly. There's Boko Haram in Nigeria, now spreading across Cameroon, Chad, and Niger, and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb in Mali, now threatening others in the region. Al-Shabaab is in Somalia, but their attacks reach into Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia. And in the north, ISIS took hold in Libya and now threatens most of North Africa. Terrorism now kills more people in Africa than in the Middle East, but African terrorism has mostly been contained to Africa, rarely spreading to Europe or the US. As militant groups expand and create new alliances, that may change. We have a great panel with us today. We have Dr. Raymond Gilpin, Dean of Academic Affairs at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. We have the Ambassador of Niger, Hassana Alidou, and Colonel Charlie Snyder, a professor of African Studies at the Institute of World Politics. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So, Raymond, if I can start with you. Africa is 53% Muslim. It never was radicalized before. Suddenly, that's not the case.
Yeah, regrettably, what we have is a complex emergency. If you look at most of the groups that you mentioned, they all started as small protest groups against bad governance and corruption locally, and it spread exponentially, not just beyond the communities, but also beyond national borders. The challenge becomes in cases where economic and governance is really weak, you then have religion stepping in as a proxy. Religion not just as a moral conscience, but also as a provider of social services. And very quickly, these religious groups morph into extremism. And this extremism is fueled from in my view, two main sources. One, the local discontent, and secondly, global radicalization on the internet, via SMS text. You have these messages that resonate because they feel so alienated and they don't have an outlet. And very quickly we see these groups making alliances or purported alliances with international terrorism and becoming really lethal.
You know, Ambassador, I'm so glad that you're here because Niger is really a very interesting country. It's relatively peaceful, and yet you have surrounding you countries that have these militant groups that are now making incursions into Niger. How on the ground is this affecting people in Niger?
What is happening in the region has affected tremendously Niger. We have today, when you look at the effect of Boko Haram, you have a humanitarian crisis. More than 100,000 people running from Nigeria coming into Niger, which has experienced peace for so many years. That's one thing. But to look at also the involvement of some of the youth, disfranchised youth, as Dean just said, into the recruitment process of Boko Haram. I think that's very worrisome. And it has taken all the military and the defense forces' efforts, the government effort, to try to contain the effect of Boko Haram. So it has created not only humanitarian crisis, but security crisis in Niger. And the burden is also development crisis, because the resources that are allocated for development, for agriculture, for education, for health, now has to be diverted more into security.
Well, also Niger, for the refugees that you have, the UN recently cut the budget that they gave you for that. So this is actually falling on the government of Niger to take care of them.
The burden of having the refugee in the country is really on the government. When you welcome people, you cannot say we are not going to address their need. They bring their educational need, they bring their health need, they bring their nutrition need. All this is about respect of human rights of the refugee. And therefore, Niger government has made a tremendous effort to welcome the refugee. And so we need to look at how can the international community really develop a really appropriate, adequate intervention to support the country.
Charlie, the international community, everyone wants them to act, but it's a difficult thing to actually act in a way that helps. Sometimes you can even act in a way that hurts. How do you see the U.S. being able to help in these situations?
I think that is the key. We have to become a microphone, a megaphone for the imams who speak traditionally for Africa, the brotherhoods in Senegal, the moderates who send girls to school, etc. Give them a microphone so that that version of Islam is effectively transmitted into the peripheral areas of the states. So when the radicals come, there's a counter message that says there's a better way. But to make it a better way, we can't step back from dealing with the human problem, which has got to do with populations being forced to move to places they can't possibly sustain themselves. You put these people in zones where they can be recruited, where they become soldiers by night, refugees by day, because they're too close to the conflicts. The region and the local people know the answers to these problems. The UN is too distant in many cases to get it right on the ground, and so you get these accusations of fraud and abuse because the headquarters can't really control it. We need to use the most effective means, and in many cases in Africa, it's sub-regional entities. They need to be mobilized because they're closer to the problems and inform the solutions. Solving things from New York or from Geneva isn't going to work. It needs to be solved in Abuja and other places in Africa.
Ambassador, your country is more than 90% Muslim. How do the people feel about these extremist threats?
For us, the majority of people in our region who are practicing Islam are not terrorists. And so therefore, how can you tap into this majority group as the force that is going to provide you the solution? I think we have to have a dialogue with those people who are promoting peaceful Islam so that they are part of the solution, but we cannot have a conceptualization whereby we don't make a distinction between really people who have radicalized because of many, many issues and people who are really trying to live peacefully in their community and practice their faith.
The White House's America First foreign policy calls for peace through strength, but with a focus on American interests and national security. While most Americans understand that fighting terrorism around the world is in America's own interest, the same is not always true of long-standing conflicts, several of which continue across the continent. When conflict is new, the media floods in, and the world takes notice. But as it drags on, conflict becomes the steady state. It's no longer news. Libya, DRC, Darfur, South Sudan. In each, conflict continues to rage, but few tell their stories anymore. The death tolls can at times be staggering, but without public outcry, there is little support for the world to intervene. Meanwhile, the conflict drags on and on. These conflict places really create failed states with their own risks, don't they?
Absolutely. You're right in pointing out that conflict in Africa has generally morphed. We're seeing less state-on-state conflict. We're seeing fewer actual wars, but we are seeing across the continent, whether the countries are directly or indirectly affected, this persistent low-intensity conflict. And what that does is, over time, it erodes not just the physical facilities, but people's trust in their governments at both national and local levels. The African Union has its African peace and security architecture. A lot of the regional organizations also have likewise. But if you take a closer look at a lot of these approaches, they're addressing mainly the war fighting or the physical battle side of things. And it's very difficult to see this complementarity between the militaristic approach to security and the broader approach to security that focuses on the welfare of the individual citizens. And this is one gap, a glaring gap, that explains the persistence of low-intensity conflict and the ease with which people who've been subjected to this. So addressing low-intensity conflict does require the African Union, the regional organizations, to address the military side, the war-fighting side of militancy, violent militancy across the continent. But if that's not complemented by job creation, by provision of basic services, health, education, by infrastructure provisions, we might win the occasional battle, but we are losing the war, not just for the hearts and minds of Africans across the continent, but also for Africa's future.
You know, Charlie, in these kinds of long-standing conflicts, these aren't militant groups from outside that are coming in. These are within countries or across borders. Do you fight them differently than you fight the militant groups?
I think you do, because for one thing, the ideology is different behind it in each individual case. We've forgotten about the people dying in Darfur, the people dying in Eastern Congo, people dying in the Nuba Mountains, people dying elsewhere other than Boko Haram. What about the Delta in Nigeria with its constant unrest and death? What about the deaths from a lack of government services in places like Somalia, where there is no government and hasn't been for years? You need to use a basic institutionalization approach. There's a lack of governance at the local region. Too many African governments have control of the cities, even today, with very little presence in the rural areas, if you will. And one of the solutions, I think, is to find a way to empower, through the African political system, re-empower the chiefs and that kind of thing as a transition to more effective local government. How do you do that? You make sure that some of the aid that's already coming in gets there. You make sure that there's proportional divvying up of the resources. Just like we have in some state legislatures in the United States where X number of counties get X number of dollars just because of the population.
You know, this issue of having the regional institutions and regional governments working with each other to bring peace, do you think that that's viable?
If you have transnational conflict, then the burden is not only on single countries, but it's on all the countries involved to come up with really a strategy whereby they mobilize their resources, military resources, political resources, to look at how to address the issue. And I do also agree with my colleagues here. Military solution is going to be, yes, part of the solution, but strengthening the country's governance structure is very critical. You have to have leaderships that are implementing policies and programs they're elected for. This is very important. But you have also to decentralize. You have to strengthen not only the urban areas, but also the rural areas. You have to build capacity to educate the youth. You have to build capacity to give youth employment so that they're not attracted other groups.
Countries that come out of conflict are statistically shown to be more likely to go back into conflict within a few years. What breaks the endless cycle? Peacebuilding and economic development. The White House's proposed budget calls for increasing military spending, but also for dramatically reducing foreign assistance to offset the military ramp-up. The president of the African Development Bank recently said that U.S. foreign aid cuts could turn Africa into a recruiting field for terrorists. Fighting conflict often requires hard power, but it also needs soft power. So this is a lot of what you've been talking about. what is the relationship of hard and soft power? What is the balance that's needed?
It's a debate that's been ongoing for a while, and I don't necessarily see a dichotomy between hard power and soft power. I think I would jettison both and go for smart power. Because
I like that one.
Because I think fundamentally across the continent, we've been accustomed to it's either a big, strong man or we invest in social services, health, education, and do a bit of infrastructure. But I think smart power combines a lot more. It includes the trade issue. It includes investment in the private sector and entrepreneurship, opening markets. It also includes the diplomatic side in this, because smart power also includes the use of what I would call muscular diplomacy. I would step away from this focus on how much aid are we giving, how much aid can we give, particularly in the security sector, to how do we utilize all the instruments of national power that we have, be it financial, economic, information, or military, and have more strategic partnerships with African countries that would allow them to become, more resilient and more responsive to the needs of their people.
Charlie, I'm thinking about the Africa Command, AFRICOM, and how much they actually do that is outside of pure military engagement. That it's actually the Department of Defense that is doing a lot of the soft power as well, is it not?
I think it is true, and I think the Africa Command is a valuable new tool that was added. I think Africa for too long suffered in the military context from not having its own advocate at the command level. Not that AFRICOM is overly resource-rich, but at least has a four-star general speaking in the terms that the Defense Department understands, but also one that understands the basic point that I can't shoot my way out of most problems. I need to solve the underlying causes. And so AFRICOM is very careful, I think, to make sure they reach out to populations with med caps, where they do some medical assistance to show the kids and their mothers, et cetera, that this is just not the face of war. This is a concerned entity that's reaching out in many ways. That's not to say that AFRICOM doesn't have the hard power things that it needs to do. We're seeing that in Somalia and other places. That is what AFRICOM is about. They do have guns for a reason, and you can't expect them to be there without using that kind of thing. But I think they're doing it in a smart way. They're also going to be one of the big advocates on the medical side that says when you look at the strategic threats, if you will, the interests of the United States and Africa, yes, it's countering terrorism, but also because the world is so globally connected now, how do you stop Ebola? How do you stop some disease we never heard of before? But you need the experts.
Took the lead on Ebola, didn't it?
They did. They were one of the most effective responses. And we shouldn't forget that. That's something that's valuable not only to Africa, but it's valuable globally.
For me, the way I interpret is security equals development and development equals security. You cannot have security, peace and security without development, without digging people out of deep poverty. This is very fundamental. I appreciate the cooperation that the U.S. has with Niger in terms of strengthening the military capacity, in terms of training, in terms of equipment, in terms of sharing of intelligence. Because if we don't have that, maybe we are going to be really fragilized in terms of securing our border. So we're not going to say this is not important. This is very, very important, and this is very, very appreciated, because if you don't have a secure border, you don't have your sovereignty. Therefore, the issue of development is moot. But at the same time, you cannot just build on the military strength without building the civilian. I think this goes hand in hand. So that's why for us, we always argue, just like President Issoufou Mahamadou does, that security means development, and development means security. Investing in agriculture, investing in healthcare, investing particularly in education and training for the youth are going to be critical.
I think it's very interesting with apropos of what your president says, of security is development and development is security. Our discussion on security today, we've had very little discussion about tanks and MiGs and things like that. We've really been talking about development. The nexus really is very tightly pulled together. So let's take some questions from our viewers. Sandra in Nairobi writes, President Trump is focusing on security and terrorism while cutting foreign aid. Won't this reduce America's relationship with Africa to a narrow and overly militarized engagement? Ambassador, do you think there's a risk?
For me, what I'm hearing, President Trump in Riyadh, when he was addressing the head of state, he was talking about also looking at areas of investment, areas of looking at really cooperation, but also how to support these countries and to have good governance, to have economic vitality in these conflict areas. The government will need the support of the U.S. to strengthen the military capacity to secure the border. But at the same time, I also appreciate the fact that even the AFRICOM is having a multi-dimensional intervention. There is military intervention, but also they're cooperating, for example, with institutions like USAID, so that maybe all is bundled into military intervention. But when you look at even on the AFRICOM side, you see that there is a multi-dimensional aspect. And we really think that to have the military, but also to have the development areas, particularly promoting investment in Africa in areas like agriculture, healthcare, and education, I think is going to be very significant for the administration.
Authoritarian governments often label political opponents as terrorists, notes Yosef in Seattle. How can we make sure that U.S. support for anti-terrorism doesn't result in greater conflict and instability? So Raymond, this does happen. How can we be sure?
It happens a lot more than we care to admit. But the short answer is we cannot be sure. Because in many cases we see authoritarian governments who are being supplied or sold lethal capacity. We see Praetorian Guards being trained ostensibly for counterterrorism, but we do have record of them being used against their own people and against opposition leaders, which is why, as the ambassador rightly pointed out, we need a more comprehensive approach to partnership, particularly in the area of security cooperation. We should not only view it through a military prism, for the simple reason that instability in Africa is not an exclusively military phenomenon. And so we do need other tools in the toolbox. And we need to invest as much in governance, infrastructure, and economic opportunity as we do in fighting and taking down terrorists. Because if we do not, then it's a very short-term approach to this issue. We might be able to decapitate a militant group by taking out their leadership, but you have not addressed the radicalization that brought most of the young people to these groups in the first place.
You take one out,
you
and
might
another
take
comes
one
in.
out, another one comes in.
Tunisia.
Exactly, or you could take your pick across the globe.
And last, Amy in Silver Spring asks, the U.S. apologized for not intervening in the Rwandan genocide. In the current climate of America First, would President Trump intervene? Now, Charlie, I understand that you actually knew President Paul Kagame before he was president. Do you think that President Trump would intervene now?
I think we've evolved since then. One thing we didn't have to bring into the game back then was, could we have put African troops on the ground? Could the U.S., with its unique capacity to move large numbers of men and things, have moved African troops from somewhere else? I think the answer today is very different. The Angolan army, for instance, has been vetted in civil war and intervened effectively enough in Kinshasa, which people overlooked, one of those fights that you talk about never thinking about. The Rwandan army itself is busy in peacekeeping.
There are a huge number of peacekeepers that
the
are Rwandan, right?
The Burundians are engaged as well. So the question may be very different. Can you put U.S. boots on the ground? The question may be Africa's calling for assistance in a particular place. And then the United States and the Chinese, for that matter, who are now present in peacekeeping, and even the Russians, they're present in Syria. why not a global coalition intervene? So it's not the United States stepping in, et cetera. And I think the key is to look for the force multipliers, which are the helicopters, the transport, et cetera, the intelligence, the ability to see on the ground over vast areas that the others don't have, to feed an African intervention force. That's a different question than I'm going to put American boots on the ground because it's the right thing to do and people are screaming about it and that's what I'm going to do. The question needs to be different. It needs to be Africa's asking. It's clearly an international human rights violation of a massive kind. We've reached out as a group to do something.
It's not boots on the ground necessarily. It's everything else around it.
It's what's the problem and how do we respond to it. And I agree. I think President Trump is right. We should not be responding alone unless it's Americans that are in danger. That's a different question.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thank you so much to my guests, Professor Raymond Gilpin, Ambassador Hassana Adidu, and Colonel Charlie Snyder. To our viewers in Africa, America, and around the world, thank you so much for joining us.